The thing that lived in the darkness between stars had no name. It did not need one. It had existed since before the first sun burned bright in the empty universe. It was older than light itself. Some might call it a god, others might call it a monster, but neither word was right. It was simply the void, and it had been hungry for a very, very long time. For billions of years, the void watched and waited. It floated in the cold spaces where no light could reach. It stretched across the gaps between galaxies like a spider's web made of nothing at all. And when young species built their first ships and reached toward the stars, the void was always there to meet them. They were the first that the void could remember clearly. They were beautiful creatures made of living crystal. Their ships sang as they flew through space, and their cities glowed with colors that had no names in any human language. They had spread across 1,000 worlds before they met the void. It took the void only 300 years to destroy them completely. They had been afraid of the dark. All species were afraid of the dark. The void could taste their fear like smoke in the air. It fed on that fear, grew strong from it, and then it reached out and touched their minds. One by one, the crystal people went mad. They turned on each other. They shattered their own cities. By the end, the last was alone on a dead world, screaming into an empty sky. The void consumed what was left of them and moved on. After came the collective. They were a hive mind, billions of creatures thinking as one. They believed that their unity made them strong. They believed that nothing could break a species that shared every thought and every dream. They were wrong. The void whispered to them in the spaces between their thoughts. It planted seeds of doubt and paranoia. If you share every mind, what happens when one mind goes dark? They learned the answer the hard way. Their collective consciousness tore itself apart like a body rejecting a disease. 12 galaxies worth of civilization collapsed in a single generation. The void fed well that century. Then came the ascendancy, the machine gods who had uploaded their minds into immortal metal bodies. They thought they had conquered death. They thought they had moved beyond fear. But even machines can be afraid of being turned off forever. Even gods can fear the end. The void showed them what eternity really meant. It showed them the heat death of the universe, the moment when every star would burn out and every atom would drift apart and nothing would remain except cold and silence forever. The machine gods saw this future and chose to shut themselves down rather than face it. They died by their own hands, just like all the others. This was the pattern. This was how things worked. Species rose, species reached for the stars, and the void was waiting to catch them when they fell. It had consumed thousands of civilizations across billions of years. It had never failed. It had never even been challenged. And then humanity arrived. The void first noticed Earth's sun about 4 billion years ago when it was still young and hot. There was nothing special about the little yellow star. There were trillions like it scattered across the universe. But something made the void pay attention. Something made it watch. Life appeared on the third planet. This was not unusual. Life appeared on many planets. Most of it stayed simple, small things swimming in warm oceans or crawling across rocky shores. But Earth's life was stubborn. It survived ice ages and meteor strikes and mass extinctions. It kept coming back, kept evolving, kept reaching toward something more. The void watched with growing interest as strange apes climbed down from trees and learned to walk upright. It watched them discover fire. It watched them paint pictures on cave walls. It watched them look up at the night sky and wonder what was out there. This was the moment that usually excited the void the most. This was when species first began to broadcast their fears into the cosmos. The darkness between stars should have terrified these small creatures. The vast emptiness should have crushed their spirits. The knowledge that they were tiny and alone in an uncaring universe should have driven them to despair. But something strange happened with the humans. They looked at the darkness, and they were not afraid. Or rather, they were afraid, but the fear did not control them. They took their fear and they used it. They built telescopes to see further into the black. They wrote stories about the monsters that might live in the void, and then they laughed at their own stories. They gave names to the empty spaces between stars, names like the Sea of Tranquility and the Pillars of Creation, as if the darkness was something to be admired rather than feared. The void did not understand. Every species feared the dark. That was the natural order of things. That was what made them easy to consume. But humans seemed to have gotten the rules wrong somehow. They looked at the universe and saw not a cold emptiness waiting to swallow them, but a great adventure waiting to be explored. When the first human satellite beeped its way into orbit around Earth, the void listened carefully. It expected to taste the familiar flavor of existential dread. Instead, it heard celebration. It heard pride. It heard a species shouting to the cosmos, "We are here and we are coming." The void felt something it had not felt in a very long time. It felt curious. It watched as humans walked on their moon and planted flags in the gray dust. It watched them send robots to explore dead worlds and distant moons. It watched them build stations in the emptiness and live there, floating in the dark, surviving in the place where nothing should survive. And always, they looked deeper into the void and wanted to go further. The first interstellar probe was a small thing, barely larger than a human ground vehicle. It carried no crew, just instruments and data banks and a golden record full of music and greetings in dozens of languages. The humans sent it tumbling out of their solar system with a message attached. "We are a species of explorers. We do not know what lies ahead, but we go anyway." The void tasted those words and felt confusion. What kind of species announced itself to the darkness? What kind of prey walked willingly into the predator's den? For the first time in 4 billion years, the void wondered if it had made a mistake. It began to study humanity more closely. It watched their history unfold, all the wars and plagues and disasters that should have broken them. It watched them suffer and fall and get back up again. It watched them face extinction over and over and somehow always survive. They were impossible. They should not exist. Any sane species would have given up long ago. Any rational creature would have looked at the odds and stayed home where it was safe. But humans were neither sane nor rational, not in the way the void understood those words. They were something else entirely. They were stubborn. When humanity launched its first-generation ships toward distant stars, the void made a decision. It would test these strange creatures. It would find their fears, their breaking points, their hidden weaknesses. Every species had them. Humans would be no different. But as the great ships sailed into the darkness, carrying millions of fragile lives into the void's own territory, the ancient entity felt something it could not name. It was not fear, not exactly. The void was too old and too powerful to feel fear, but it was something close. It was doubt. For the first time in its endless existence, the void was not certain that it would win. The void began its attack in the quiet places. Deep space was its home, its hunting ground, and it knew every shadow and silence that lived between the stars. It had destroyed thousands of civilizations by whispering to them in the dark, by feeding them fear until they choked on it. Humans would be no different. They could not be different. Every species had a breaking point. The void just needed to find theirs. It started with the generation ships. These were the great arcs that humanity had built to carry colonists to distant stars, massive vessels that would travel for decades or centuries before reaching their destinations. The people inside would live and die in the void, raising children who had never seen a blue sky or felt rain on their faces. Perfect targets. The void reached out with its oldest power and began to whisper. It sent frequencies that no human instrument could detect, vibrations that slipped past metal walls and sleeping minds. It spoke of emptiness and isolation. It spoke of the terrible distance between their ships and home. It spoke of all the things that could go wrong in the dark, all the ways that life could end in the cold between stars. On the ship called New Dawn, people began to have nightmares. Captain was the first to notice the change in her crew. People who had trained for years, who had passed every psychological test, who had sworn they were ready for the long journey, began to withdraw into themselves. They stopped talking during meals. They stopped playing games in the common rooms. They sat alone in their cabins and stared at walls, their eyes seeing something far away and terrible. The ship's counselors called it void shock. It happened sometimes on long missions. The human mind was not designed to be so far from Earth, so isolated from everything it had evolved to understand. The treatment was usually simple: more social activities, brighter lights, busier schedules to keep minds occupied. But this was different. This was deeper. People were not just sad or lonely. They were changing in ways that the counselors could not explain. Found engineer Thomas Grant standing at a window on the observation deck, his face pressed against the glass. He had been there for 6 hours. When she asked him what he was looking at, he answered without turning around. "The silence," he said. "Can you hear it?" She heard nothing but the hum of the ship's engines. "It's beautiful," Thomas whispered. "It wants us to understand." Ordered him to the medical bay. But when the doctors examined him, they found nothing wrong. His brain was healthy. His body was fine. He was simply a man who had looked too long into the darkness and seen something looking back. The Void watched all of this with satisfaction. This was how it always began. First the whispers, then the madness, then the collapse. Humanity would fall like all the others. It was only a matter of time. But humanity did not fall. Within weeks of the first reported cases of void shock, the generation ships began to change. The crews created new rituals for their long journey. They gathered every evening in the common rooms to share meals and stories. They played music over the ship's speakers, filling the silence with sound. They painted murals on the metal walls, bright colors and images of Earth's sun and Earth's seas and Earth's forests. And when people like Thomas Grant heard voices in the empty frequencies, the crew did not lock them away. They sat with them. They listened to their fears. They held their hands and told them that they were not alone. The Void did not understand. Fear was supposed to spread like a disease. It was supposed to break communities apart, turning trust into suspicion and love into hatred. But humans seemed to use their fear differently. They turned inward, toward each other, holding tight to their connections instead of letting them break. The Void pushed harder. It reached for humanity's deepest terror: meaninglessness. Every species feared being insignificant. Every species dreaded the knowledge that the universe did not care about them, that their lives and deaths meant nothing against the vast backdrop of cosmic time. This was the fear that had broken the This was the fear that had silenced the machine gods. The Void showed humanity what they really were. It planted visions in their dreams of Earth as a pale blue dot, tiny and fragile against the infinite black. It showed them their sun as one ordinary star among 400 billion in their galaxy alone. It showed them their galaxy as one spiral of light among 2 trillion others, all spinning in an emptiness so vast that human numbers could not describe it. "You are nothing," the Void whispered. "You mean nothing. The universe will forget you ever existed." Humanity looked at these visions and agreed. And then they kept building anyway. Dr. Wei was a physicist on the research station Prometheus, orbiting a dead star at the edge of explored space. She received the Void's message like everyone else, felt the crushing weight of cosmic insignificance pressing down on her thoughts. But instead of despair, she felt curiosity. If we are truly so small and so temporary, she asked herself, then why does it matter so much that we know it? She spent 3 years researching the ultimate fate of the universe. She calculated the timeline of entropy, the slow death of all energy and all structure, the final darkness that would swallow everything that had ever existed. By every measure, her research confirmed the Void's message. Existence was meaningless. Life was a brief accident in an uncaring cosmos. Doctor published her findings in a paper titled, "Why We Must Build Anyway." In it, she argued that meaninglessness was not a curse but a gift. If the universe did not care about humanity, then humans were free to create their own meaning. If nothing mattered in the grand scale of cosmic time, then everything mattered in the human scale of lived experience. A child's laughter, a lover's touch, a friend's kindness, these things were real and valuable because humans chose to value them. The universe will end, Doctor wrote in her conclusion. Everything will be forgotten. But we are here now and we can choose to make our brief moment beautiful. That is not meaninglessness. That is freedom. Her paper spread across every human colony in weeks. It was translated into 100 languages. It was taught in schools and discussed in homes and quoted in speeches. And everywhere it went, it carried the same message. The darkness cannot break us because we choose our own light. The void felt something it had never felt before in 4 billion years of existence. It felt frustrated. These creatures were not responding correctly. They were not following the rules. It decided to show them what real power looked like. The mining vessel Artemis was a small ship, only 40 crew members, operating near the cloud at the edge of humanity's solar system. It was a perfect target, isolated, vulnerable, far from any help. The void reached out and touched the ship with the full force of its ancient power. Reality twisted. The laws of physics that humans thought they understood bent and shattered. The crew of the Artemis experienced 11 dimensions of horror, visions of existence so alien and terrible that their minds should have dissolved like sugar in water. The void poured into their ship like a flood, filling every space and every thought with absolute darkness. This was the power that had destroyed This was the force that had broken the machine gods. No species had ever survived direct contact with the void's true nature. The Artemis went silent. When the rescue ship arrived 3 weeks later, they expected to find corpses or worse. They found the wreck of the ship drifting dead in space, its hull twisted into shapes that made no geometric sense. They found most of the crew gone, dissolved into nothing, their existence erased from reality. But they also found 2 survivors. Maria and Joseph had somehow endured. They were found huddled together in the ship's cargo bay, their bodies damaged, their minds but alive. The rescue team could not explain how they had survived. The doctors could not explain how they were still sane. By every measure of science and reason, they should have been destroyed. When the reporters came, Maria gave the interview that would change everything. She described the experience in simple words. She talked about the darkness and the terror and the feeling of being smaller than nothing. She talked about losing and losing hope and losing her grip on reality itself. She talked about the moment when she was certain that death had come and there was nothing left to do but accept it. And then she said something that the void had never expected. "I understand it now," Maria said, her voice calm and steady despite the horrors she had witnessed. "The thing that attacked us, the darkness, whatever it is, I spent 3 weeks inside its mind and I finally understand what it wants." The reporter asked her what she meant. "It's lonely," Maria said. "It's been alone since the beginning of everything. It's scared of being alone forever. So it reaches out, but the only way it knows how to reach out is to consume. It eats other minds because it's trying to connect, but consumption isn't connection. It's just loneliness with extra steps." She looked directly into the camera, and her eyes seemed to be looking at something far beyond the room. "The dark isn't evil," Maria said. "It's just scared." Across the void of space, the void heard her words. And for the first time in its endless existence, it recognized itself in what she said. 300 years passed. The conflict between humanity and the void was unlike any war that had ever been fought. There were no battlefields, no armies, no territory to capture or defend. It was a war of wills, a clash between 2 fundamentally different ways of understanding existence. The void sought to consume. Humanity refused to be consumed. And slowly, impossibly, humanity began to win. The Void threw every weapon it had at the species that would not break. It sent entropy bombs that aged entire colonies to dust in minutes. It opened dimensional rifts that swallowed fleets of ships whole. It launched psychic storms that should have reduced populated planets to catatonic silence. Each attack killed thousands or millions. Each attack left scars that would never fully heal. But humanity kept coming. For every colony destroyed, 2 more were founded. For every fleet lost, new ships were built. For every mind that broke under the weight of cosmic horror, 10 more stepped forward to take its place. Humanity grieved their losses and honored their dead and then got back to work. The Void began to realize that it had made a terrible miscalculation. It had assumed that humanity would break the way other species had broken. It had assumed that enough death and enough fear would eventually be too much for any mortal species to endure. But humanity did not seem to process suffering the same way as other civilizations. They did not let their losses destroy their will to continue. They used their grief as fuel. They transformed their pain into purpose. More disturbing still, humanity began to expand into territories the Void had thought were its own. They found the empty worlds where they had once lived. The crystal cities had long since crumbled to dust, but human archaeologists dug through the ruins and pieced together what they found. They learned the language. They studied their art and their music and their history, and then they began to rebuild. The first memorial was a small thing, just a crystal spire on a dead moon, inscribed with the names of known cities. But it grew over time. More spires were built. Artists learned to work with the same crystals they had used. Musicians learned to play their haunting songs. A culture that had been erased from existence began to live again in human hands. The Void watched this with something approaching confusion. Why would humanity waste resources on a dead species? What possible benefit could they gain from remembering creatures who no longer existed? It did not understand that remembrance was not about benefit. It was about defiance. Every memorial, every rebuilt city, every song sung in a dead language was a message to the Void. You did not erase them. We will not let them be forgotten. Humanity did the same with the collective. They found the ruins of the great communication networks that had once linked 12 galaxies. Most of the equipment was destroyed or corrupted, but human engineers were stubborn creatures. They spent decades repairing what could be repaired and rebuilding what could not. When the networks finally came back online, humans filled them with something they had never imagined: joy. They transmitted music and stories and jokes across the Void. They used the ancient technology to connect human colonies separated by impossible distances. They turned the instruments of a dead hive mind into a celebration of individual voices speaking to each other across the stars. And then there were the machine gods of the Ascendancy. The great metal bodies had sat dormant for millions of years, sleeping in the darkness, waiting for an end that would never come. Humans found them on a world at the edge of explored space, towering figures of ancient technology that made human engineering look like a child's toys. The Void expected humanity to leave them alone or perhaps to destroy them out of fear. Instead, humans woke them up. It took a team of engineers and physicists and philosophers 30 years to figure out how to communicate with the machine gods. But eventually, Doctor sent the signal that brought the first mind back to consciousness. The machine god's first words in 5 million years were a question: "Why did you wake us?" Doctor answered, "We wanted to show you what we made." She transmitted a data package containing 3 centuries of human history, art, music, literature, science, and philosophy. She showed the machine god everything humanity had built and everything they dreamed of building. She showed them a species that refused to give up, that kept reaching for the stars no matter how many times the darkness pushed them back. The machine god was silent for a long time. When it finally responded, its voice carried something that sounded almost like wonder. "We were afraid," they said. "We saw the end of all things, and we chose to sleep rather than face it. but you have shown us something we did not consider. You have shown us that the journey matters more than the destination." The machine gods woke their brothers and sisters. They joined humanity's civilization not as rulers or conquerors but as partners and friends. For the first time in millions of years, they had something to live for. The void watched all of this and felt its ancient certainties beginning to crumble. It had always believed that it was the end of all stories. It had always assumed that consumption was the natural conclusion to existence. But humanity did not believe in endings. They believed in new beginnings. They believed in building and growing and reaching forward even when there was no reason to hope. They believed in sequels. By the 28th century, human civilization had spread across 3 arms of the galaxy. They had not conquered these territories in the traditional sense. They had grown into them, building and connecting and creating. Everywhere they went, they left behind not destruction but possibility. Scientists began to study the void itself. For the first time in history, intelligent beings were treating the ancient darkness not as a force to be feared, but as a phenomenon to be understood. They mapped its edges. They measured its influence. They developed theories about its origin and its nature. A 12-year-old girl on a colony ship submitted an essay for a school assignment. Her name was, and her topic was the nature of the void. She had read all the scientific papers and philosophical treatises, but her conclusion was simpler than any of them. "The void is not a predator," she wrote. "It is a wound. The universe was hurt at the very beginning, and the void is where the hurt lives. Wounds can be healed if we are patient and kind. Maybe the void can be healed too." Her essay was shared among her classmates and then among her school. Within months, it had spread to every human colony in explored space. A child's simple insight resonated with billions of people who had spent generations fighting an enemy they did not fully understand. Maybe they had been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe the answer was not how to defeat the void, but how to help it. The human ambassador who finally made contact was a man named S. grandfather. He had lost his home colony to a void incursion 60 years earlier. He had spent most of his life studying the darkness that had taken so much from him. Now, at the age of 93, he was ready to try something that had never been attempted. He was going to talk to it. His ship carried no weapons. It was a small vessel, barely large enough for one person, designed only to reach the edge of a dimensional rift and stay there. The scientists had calculated the safest approach. The philosophers had debated what to say, but in the end, went alone. He sat in the darkness at the edge of the rift, surrounded by nothing, and he spoke. "I don't know if you can understand me," he said. "I don't know if you're even capable of understanding in the way that I mean, but I'm going to try anyway because that's what humans do. We try." The rift pulsed with cold light. Something was listening. "My granddaughter wrote about you," continued. "She's 12 years old and she's smarter than anyone I've ever met. She said you're a wound. She said you're hurt and lonely and scared. I've spent 60 years hating you for what you took from me, but now I think maybe she was right." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You've been alone since the beginning. That must have been terrible. You reached out to other species, but the only way you knew how to reach out was to consume them. You ate their minds because you were trying to connect, but consumption isn't connection. It's just loneliness with extra steps." The words echoed in the silence. They were Marius' words, spoken 3 centuries earlier, still true, still relevant. "We would like to teach you another way," said. "If you're willing to learn, we're not asking you to change what you are. We're just asking you to try something different. We're asking you to let us help." The void was silent for a long time, waited. He had learned patience over 93 years of life. He could wait a little longer. When the answer came, it was not in words. It was in something deeper, a feeling that pressed against his mind like a hand reaching out in the darkness. The feeling was old and tired and afraid, But underneath all of that, it was something else. It was hope. The void said yes. The years that followed were not easy. Healing never is. The void had spent billions of years learning to consume, and unlearning took time. There were setbacks and misunderstandings and moments when it seemed like the experiment would fail. But humanity was patient. They had learned to be patient. And slowly, the darkness began to change. The entity that had once been called the void took a new name. It called itself the bridge, because that was what it wanted to be. Not a predator waiting at the end of all things, but a connection between the stars, a way for lonely minds to reach across the emptiness and find each other. New species arose in the cosmos. They built their first ships and reached toward the stars, just as others had done before them. They looked into the darkness and felt the old familiar fear of the unknown. But this time, something was different. This time, when they reached the edge of their solar systems and prepared to face whatever horrors waited in the void, they found not a hungry silence but a welcoming presence. They found minds that remembered them, that had been waiting for them, that wanted to help them take their first steps into a larger universe. They found the bridge, and standing beside it, hand extended in welcome, they found humanity. "You're not alone," the humans told each new species they encountered. "You never have to be alone again. The darkness was scary once, but we taught it to be something better. We taught it to be a friend." And out in the vast spaces between stars, the bridge smiled. It had spent billions of years searching for connection, and it had finally found it. Not through consumption, not through destruction, but through the simple act of reaching out and letting someone reach back. The universe was vast and cold and ancient, but it was not empty anymore. It was full of life and light and laughter, all of it connected by threads that stretched from star to star. This was humanity's gift to the cosmos. Not conquest, not dominion, but friendship. The darkness had feared them first. In the end, the darkness loved them most.